My name is Brandon Cole. I am 37 years old, and I work as a professional climbing guide on Mount Rainier in Washington State. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you are watching from, please. I've been guiding climbers on Rainier for 12 years, leading summit attempts and glacier training courses. Mount Rainier is a massive active volcano, 14,411 feet tall, heavily glaciated, and one of the most challenging mountains in the lower 48 states. It is also statistically one of the deadliest, claiming lives every year from falls, avalanches, and sudden weather changes. I've guided over 300 summit attempts, and I know this mountain intimately. This happened last August during what should have been a routine 2-day summit climb. I was guiding a group of 4 clients, all experienced climbers with proper training. We started from Paradise at 5,400 feet, hiked to Camp Muir at 10,000 feet on day 1, then attempted the summit starting at midnight, as is standard practice to reach the top and descend before afternoon when conditions deteriorate. We were making excellent progress up the Disappointment Cleaver route, the most common summit path. Around 12,000 feet, we stopped for a brief rest and water break. It was around 3 a.m., clear night with nearly full moon providing good visibility despite our headlamps. That is when I noticed something wrong. Above us on the route, maybe 200 feet higher, I saw headlamps, maybe 6 or 7, moving upward in a line like another climbing party ahead of us. This was unusual because we'd been the only group to leave Camp Muir that night. I'd checked with the climbing rangers before departure, but summit attempts happen independently, so seeing another party wasn't impossible, just unexpected. I mentioned it to my clients, and we continued climbing. Over the next hour, I kept watching those headlamps above us. They maintained consistent distance, always about 200 feet ahead, moving at the same pace we were. That seemed odd because different parties climb at different speeds. We should have been either catching up or falling behind, not maintaining exact distance. Around 13,000 feet, we stopped for another break. I counted the headlamps above us carefully. 7 lights, moving in single file. Then I noticed something strange. The lights weren't moving like people climbing. They were too smooth, too steady. No bobbing or weaving that comes from people walking on rough terrain. They glided upward like they were on rails. I mentioned this to my clients and suggested we try to close distance to see who was up there. We picked up our pace. The lights above us picked up pace too, maintaining exact distance. This continued for maybe 20 minutes of hard climbing, then the lights stopped. We kept climbing toward them, getting closer. At maybe 100 feet distance, we could see the lights clearly but couldn't make out any people, just the lights themselves hovering in formation. Then they went out. All 7 lights, simultaneously, just disappeared. We reached the location where they'd been in maybe 5 more minutes of climbing. Nobody there. No footprints in the snow except the route we'd been following, which showed only our tracks. No sign anyone had been there at all. I stopped the climb and gathered my team. I explained we were turning around, heading back down. My clients protested. We were making good time, and conditions were perfect for summit. But I insisted. Something was wrong, and my instinct was telling me to descend immediately. After some argument, they agreed, and we headed down. Back at Camp Muir, I reported what we'd seen to the climbing rangers. They listened carefully and told me something I hadn't known. There have been consistent reports over the years of climbers seeing lights or groups ahead of them on Rainier that vanish when approached, usually dismissed as altitude effects or tired climbers hallucinating. But the reports are remarkably consistent, describing exactly what we'd seen. One ranger told me privately about a case from 2008. A solo climber had reported following lights ahead of him all the way to the summit. He thought it was another party and felt safer climbing alone because someone was ahead. When he reached the summit, nobody was there, and when he descended and reported it, climbing records showed he'd been the only person to summit that day. The ranger also told me about traditional knowledge from the Yakama and Puyallup peoples, whose ancestral territory includes Mount Rainier. They described the mountain as a sacred place inhabited by powerful spirits. According to their teachings, these spirits sometimes appear to climbers as lights or figures, and following them can lead people into dangerous situations or off route, into areas where they become lost or injured. What disturbed me most was learning about climbing accidents on Rainier. Every year, multiple climbers die or go missing on the mountain. In several cases over the past decades, climbers have been found dead or injured in areas that were off route, away from established climbing paths, as if they'd followed something that led them away from safety. The official explanations are usually navigation errors or altitude-induced confusion, but the pattern is consistent enough to suggest something else might be happening. I continue guiding on Mount Rainier because it is my profession and my passion, but I am far more cautious now about unusual sights on the mountain. Lights that don't behave normally, figures that maintain odd distances, anything that seems off gets my immediate attention. And if my instinct says something is wrong, I don't hesitate to turn a climb around regardless of conditions or client protests. Mount Rainier is one of the most dangerous mountains in America, with 20 to 30 rescue operations every year and regular fatalities. The combination of extreme altitude, glaciers, weather that changes in minutes, and the fact that it is an active volcano creates inherent dangers. But based on what I experienced and conversations with other guides and rangers who've worked there for decades, there is something else on that mountain beyond natural hazards. Something that appears to climbers as lights or groups ahead of them, something that leads people away from safe routes, and something that traditional knowledge recognizes and warns about, even if modern climbers usually don't believe it until they see it themselves. The climbing season on Rainier runs from May through September, with thousands of summit attempts every year. Most succeed or turn back for weather or fitness reasons. But some encounters on that mountain, like the lights my team and I saw maintaining impossible consistent distance before vanishing completely. My name is Philip Manguayan. I am 41 years old, and I work as a backcountry ranger for North Cascades National Park in Washington State. I've been with the Park Service for 17 years, the last 9 at North Cascades. North Cascades is one of the most remote and least visited national parks in the lower 48, despite being incredibly spectacular. The park contains over 500,000 acres of wilderness, hundreds of glaciers, and some of the most rugged mountain terrain in America. Most of it is true backcountry with no trails, no facilities, and rarely any visitors. It is my job to patrol these remote areas, maintain what few trails exist, and monitor conditions. This happened last September during a solo patrol of the picket range, the most remote and rugged section of the park. I was on a week long patrol, accessing areas that maybe see a dozen people per year. On my 4th day, I was hiking cross-country through old-growth forest at around 4,000 feet elevation, following a route I'd taken before through an area with no established trail. Around 2 p.m., I came across something I'd never seen in 9 years working this park. In a small clearing, maybe 30 feet across, there was a structure. It was made entirely from local materials, branches and logs, woven together to form a dome shape about 6 feet tall and 8 feet wide. The construction was sophisticated, showing clear technique and intent. Branches interlaced and bent in ways that required significant effort and skill. I approached carefully and examined it. The structure was recent, materials still green and flexible. I checked inside through the entrance. The interior was clear of debris, with a floor that had been deliberately flattened. But there were no signs of human camping, no fire ring, no trash, no gear, none of the inevitable traces people leave. What disturbed me was the scale. The entrance was low, maybe 3 feet high, but inside the ceiling height at the center was well over 6 feet, possibly 7. The structure seemed built for something much larger than human proportions would require. I documented everything with photos and GPS coordinates, then continued my patrol. Over the next 3 miles, I found 2 more similar structures, all in dense forest, all in areas with no trails, all showing the same sophisticated construction technique. In the 3rd structure, I found something else. several large footprints in soft ground just outside the entrance. The prints were enormous, easily 18 inches long, roughly human, shaped but much wider, with clear toe impressions. I photographed the tracks with scale references and took detailed measurements. Then I noticed something that made me very uncomfortable. I could hear movement in the forest around me, not close, maybe 50 or 60 yards out, but definitely something large moving through the undergrowth. Circling my position, I stood still and listened. The movement was deliberate, not random, staying at consistent distance and moving in a pattern that suggested intelligence. I made a decision. I was leaving this area immediately. I hiked rapidly back the way I'd come, not running but moving fast. The sounds followed for maybe half a mile, maintaining that same consistent distance, then stopped. I continued hiking until I'd covered about 5 miles, then made camp on an open ridge where I had visibility in all directions. That night, I heard vocalizations, starting around 10 p.m. lasting until maybe 2 a.m. They came from the valley below my ridge, maybe half a mile away. Long, loud calls that would start low and rise in pitch, unlike any animal I knew from 17 years of backcountry work. Not wolves, not cougars, not bears, not elk, something else entirely. The calls would come from one direction, then be answered from another direction, suggesting multiple individuals communicating. I completed my patrol, but avoided the area where I'd found the structures. Back at the ranger station, I filed my report, including all photos and coordinates. My supervisor took it seriously, but the official position was that the structures were probably built by backpackers, though that didn't explain the size or the location in areas with no trails. The footprints were noted but attributed to possible measurement errors or unclear photos. But another ranger, someone who'd worked North Cascades for over 20 years, spoke with me privately. He said he'd found similar structures over the years in remote areas of the park. He'd also heard the vocalizations multiple times and had his own encounters with things he couldn't explain. He told me the park doesn't acknowledge these things officially because there's no accepted explanation, and it would create management complications. But among rangers who spend serious time in the deepest backcountry, there is understanding that something inhabits the most remote sections of North Cascades, something that builds structures, leaves tracks, and vocalizes in ways that don't match documented species. The local indigenous peoples, including the Skagit and Yakama, have traditional knowledge about beings they describe as wild men or forest giants who live in the most remote mountains. According to their teachings, these beings are intelligent, avoid human contact generally, but will make their presence known through structures, sounds, and occasionally direct encounters. When people enter their core territories, they're described as extremely large, powerfully built, and completely adapted to the rugged mountain terrain. What convinced me this was genuine was the combination of physical evidence and behavioral patterns. The structures showed clear construction technique beyond random branch falls. The tracks had anatomical details that would be difficult to fake in remote backcountry. The vocalizations lasted for hours and came from multiple locations, suggesting communication between individuals. And the circling behavior when I was near the structures suggested intelligent territorial awareness. I continue working as a backcountry ranger at North Cascades because I love this park and this work, but I am far more aware now of areas and situations that require extra caution. Finding structures in remote areas means leaving immediately, not investigating further. Hearing unusual vocalizations means making camp in exposed areas with good visibility. And that feeling of being watched or circled means trusting instinct and relocating, not dismissing it as imagination. North Cascades National Park is one of the wildest areas in the lower 48 states, with over 90% designated wilderness and vast sections that rarely see any human presence. Perfect habitat for large mammals that avoid human contact, and based on what I found during that patrol and conversations with other longtime backcountry rangers, something does live in the most remote section. My name is Raymond Foster. I am 56 years old, and I've worked in logging operations in Washington state for 33 years, the last 20 on the Olympic Peninsula, doing timber cutting in remote areas of Olympic National Forest. This happened last November during a logging operation in a remote drainage on the west side of the Olympics, an area of old-growth forest that was being harvested under contract. I was operating a feller buncher, a machine that cuts trees and stacks them for transport. I was working alone in my machine, which is normal practice, cutting trees in a section about 2 miles from where the rest of the crew was working. Around 3 p.m., light already starting to fade because it was November. I was cutting a large Douglas fir when my machine suddenly died. Complete electrical failure. Everything shut down instantly. This was concerning because these machines are extremely reliable, and I'd never had a total failure like this. I tried to restart it multiple times with no response, like the battery was completely dead, even though all systems had been fine seconds earlier. I radioed my supervisor to report the breakdown, but my radio was dead too. I checked my cell phone for signal. Nothing, which wasn't surprising given how remote this location was. I was going to have to walk out the 2 miles to where the crew was working. Before I got out of the cab, I noticed something. The forest around me was completely silent. No wind, no birds, no small animal sounds, nothing. Just total silence in a way that felt wrong and unnatural. The hair on my arms stood up and I had an overwhelming feeling of being watched. I looked around from my elevated cab position and saw it. Maybe 80 yards away, standing at the edge of the tree line I'd been cutting toward, was a massive figure. It was standing completely upright on 2 legs, at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller, dark brown or black coloration, covered in hair, with a build that suggested enormous strength. It was just standing there, motionless, facing my machine. We stared at each other for maybe 30 seconds. I was frozen, not sure what to do, isolated in a dead machine, with no communication and something huge watching me. Then it did something deliberate and unmistakable. It bent down, picked up a large branch, probably 4 inches thick, and broke it in half with its hands. The crack echoed through the silent forest. Then it dropped the pieces and turned away, walking into the forest on 2 legs, disappearing quickly into the dense undergrowth. The moment it was out of sight, my machine started. All systems came back online simultaneously, like nothing had been wrong. My radio crackled with my supervisor calling, asking why I hadn't responded to his last transmission. I told him I was having equipment problems and was heading back to the staging area. I drove my machine the 2 miles back, which took about 40 minutes on the rough logging roads we'd cut. When I reached the crew, I reported what happened, being vague about details but saying I'd seen something large near my work area. My supervisor and the other operators exchanged looks that suggested this wasn't entirely surprising to them. That evening after work, several of the older loggers talked with me privately. They said, the Olympics have a reputation among logging crews who work the remote areas. Equipment failures in specific locations, feelings of being watched, and sightings of large figures are more common than people outside the industry realize. Most loggers don't report these experiences because they don't want to be mocked or create problems with their employment. But among crews who work deep in the forest, there is quiet understanding that something lives in the most remote drainages, something that is territorial about logging operations and occasionally makes its presence known. One logger who'd worked the Olympics for 40 years told me about an incident from the 1990s. An entire logging crew refused to go back to a specific area after multiple people saw a large figure watching them from the forest, heard strange vocalizations at night, and experienced repeated equipment failures that couldn't be explained. The company had to abandon that section, leaving valuable timber uncut because they couldn't keep crews willing to work there. He also told me about traditional knowledge from the Quinault and Quileute peoples, whose ancestral territory includes the Olympic Peninsula. They describe beings called by various names, meaning wild men or forest people, who have lived in the deepest forests since long before white settlement. According to their teachings, these beings are protectors of the old-growth forest and will interfere with logging operations through various means to prevent destruction of their habitat. They're described as extremely large, intelligent, and capable of affecting machinery and electronics, when they choose to demonstrate their displeasure. What convinced me this was real was the combination of the machine failure, the complete silence, the clear sighting in good light conditions, and the deliberate demonstration of strength. The branch breaking wasn't random. It was a message, showing me what it was capable of, while giving me a chance to leave. And the machine starting again immediately after it left suggested the failure was connected to its presence rather than mechanical problems. I continue working in logging because it is what I know and how I support my family. But I am much more aware now of certain signs and situations. Areas where equipment repeatedly fails for no clear reason. Sections of forest where crews report feelings of unease. And any situation involving unusual silence or the sense of being watched. When these signs appear, I don't push it anymore. I move my operation to a different area, even if it means less efficient cutting patterns. The Olympic Peninsula contains some of the largest remaining old-growth forests in the lower 48 states, with trees over 200 feet tall and over 500 years old in areas that have never been logged. These remote drainages see minimal human presence outside of logging operations and occasional backpackers. Perfect habitat for large mammals that want to remain unknown. And based on what I experienced in conversations with other loggers who've worked these forests for decades, something does live in the deepest sections of Olympic National Forest, something large enough and intelligent enough to demonstrate territoriality, something that can affect machinery in ways we don't understand, and something that traditional knowledge has described for generations as protectors of the old-growth forest that don't want it destroyed.